Assalamu alaikum guys, I'm your host Amna Tariq and you're watching Desi TV USA. I'm here with you again with another special report. So let's see what we have to say. Ethnic Media Services organized a national briefing titled All Eyes on AAPI Voters in Swing States. The speakers included Shekhar Narasimha, Mohan Sheshadri, Kristen Chen, Professor James Zarsadias, Dr. Tang Yong, and Reena Shah. Let's see what else was said in this.
So, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services weekly national news briefing. I'm Sunita Sarabji, and I'm your moderator for today. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing voter electorate. More than 15 million AANHPIs will be eligible to vote on Election Day, November 5th, including many first-time voters. In battleground states, AANHPIs could constitute the margin of victory if they get out to vote. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today. They are Shekhar Narasimhan, founder and chairman of the AAPI Victory Fund, Mohan Sheshadri, executive director of the Asian Pacific Islander Political Alliance, Christine Chen, co-founder and executive director of APIA Vote, Professor James Zarsadias, associate professor of history and director of the 𝐂𝐎𝐏𝐄 Philippine Studies program at the University of San Francisco, Dr. Thanh Nguyen, president of Pivot, the progressive Vietnamese American organization, and Republican strategist Reena Shah, who will join us towards the end of our briefing today. We will send a video of today's briefing along with expanded bios for each speaker later on today. We will also send video excerpts of the presentation early next week, and we encourage you to use those on your social media channels. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat box. We will go to a 3-minute Q&A immediately after each speaker presents. So now we begin with Shekhar Narasimhan, who will give us an overview of the importance of the Get Out the Vote for AANHPIs in swing states. Shekhar is in Michigan, and he's going to offer us a perspective from the state. Welcome, Shekhar.
Thank you, Sunita, and very glad to be here. And yes, I'm actually in Detroit, sitting in a home, and sitting in the room above me are Congressman Ro Khanna and Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist of Michigan. And literally, they're talking to young people, influencers and creators from the Asian Pacific, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. We tend to bring young people together, Black and brown, of every ethnicity and faith, and have conversations that can then go viral on social media so that, in fact, we are reaching constituencies that otherwise normally never get reached. What you should know about the AANHPI vote is that, first of all, it is very significant. I prefer actually, instead of saying that we are the margin of victory, to saying now that we are the reason for victory. And let me give you the data that proves that. In the 7 battleground states, which for our reporters are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, in those 7 states that will basically determine the presidency of the United States, where the electoral votes matter the most. Doesn't mean electoral votes don't matter everywhere. They matter the most in these 7. We have approximately 1.75 million eligible AANHPI voters. The total victory margin in 2020 in the presidential in these 7 states was 385,000. Number one. Number two, in the 3 states that were the closest, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, the total margin of victory was 45,000. In each of those states, the AANHPI vote, even if it was 3% or 4%, has been material to the outcomes of these elections. So I'm going to tailor my remarks a little bit around Michigan because it has one of the most diverse AA and HPI communities and one of the fastest growing as well. Because with the advent of AI, robotics, and the reimagination of the car industry around EVs, there has really been a very significant influx, particularly of South Asians. So in fact, Michigan is one of those states, and Christine is the expert in a lot of this, so she can give you this data as well, but there are well over 23,000 AA NHPIs, particularly Indian Americans who became citizens between 21 and 24. Our job is when people turn 18, they become citizens, they move into a state, find them, talk to them, discuss the issues at hand first, figure out how they can get into that civic engagement ladder, which includes getting registered to vote, then actually going to the voting booth. And our job, is, to an extent, frankly, is to make sure we first find them and talk to them. Because guess what? In 2020, which was the most virtual campaign, and ANHPIs are among the most active on social media and using computers and automation. Even in that year, almost half our community was not reached directly by a campaign. There are many reasons for this. One of which is, I suspect strongly, they don't know how to talk to us, which language to reach, which communities to talk to, the WhatsApp channels that we frequent, or the television, media, or the ethnic reporters that are on this call. They're not sure how to be reached by you. And therefore, there is an absence of information. So we have what we call low information voters. How do you address that? You address that by going and talking to them. So the one thing we tell every candidate is show up in our communities, talk to our voters, and don't just talk to them around election time. Second, talk to them about the issues that matter to this community. As an example, among the issues that are the most important are small business, capital formation. How do we get credit for what we've done and how do we access resources? Immigration, the fact that it takes 18 years to get a visa, the fact that people are still waiting in queues, the fact that there's such a significant undocumented cohort within our communities, well over 1.3 million ANHPIs who are treated as undocumented or whose visas have expired. How do we address these issues while at the same time, not just in a humane manner, but through public policy? And then we move people to start talking about, to make public policy, we need people in positions of power to make that policy. We need people like you working for people like them so we can talk about our issues. Now, bottom line, Michigan, 3 access points. Over half the community is South Asian. Yes, there are plenty of issues that dominate right now. In addition to the economy and immigration and education, certainly the issues around Israel and Gaza are significant in Michigan. How are we talking about these? We bring people here like Congressman Ro Khanna, Lieutenant Governor Galvin Gilstrap, the Senate candidate Elisa Slotkin. And our recommendation is open the door and have the conversation. You may not have the solution and you can't tell people who are emotionally engaged not to worry. They will worry, they will care, but deal with it, address it, and then do your very best to try to listen and say what you can that is not just empathetic, but says, how can I address your concern? And this is in every facet. So teaching people that our community wants people to show up, engage with them, talk to them about their issues, care about them after the election. And so accountability after the election is equally important. We do like to go back and when we knock on doors and talk to people in community halls. We're doing a town hall tomorrow with hundreds of South Asians in the room, open air. Questions can just be written down and asked. No holds barred, just good behavior. That's all we're requesting in the room. And bottom line, I believe that that's how people go back and talk in their communities and in their families and say to each other, there is an openness to the conversation. This matters. This election matters because 1, 2, 3. So simply put, this election matters because it not just determines the future of who's in the White House, but the excitement generated by having someone whose mother was born in India, so has roots in India, in South Asia, in Asia, are significant. Every time we now hold a meeting and we say that we're going to have 50 people, we have 150. Every time we open up the door and say we need volunteers, we're getting 6 times as many as we did in 2020 or in 2016. So where exactly is the campaign with regard to all this? And the answer to that is the campaign is very much investing in our community. In all these states, there are battleground coordinators, there are ANHPI coordinators, and we work alongside them to make sure that we're all talking together to our communities and encouraging the local electeds, the state electeds, those running for office to show up, along with surrogates, as well as the candidate herself and the vice presidential candidate as himself. Let me stop there and see what kind of questions I can respond to, Sunita, if that makes sense.
We're going to start with a question from EMS editor Pilar Marrero. Pilar, please ask your question.
Hi, everyone. I think the speaker addressed it, but I'm not sure he gave us a whole picture. So every presidential election year, we hear the same thing. Yes, they're looking at our communities. They're gonna, focus on our vote. They want us to turn out. The problem is always money. Are you putting money in the turning out, in the registering of voters, and in things that are tangibly making a difference in turning out communities? And the AAPI community obviously is going to be crucial for the Democratic presidential candidate. Where is the beef? Where's the evidence that this is happening?
So, great question, Pilar. Let me answer it 2 ways. And the glass is always going to be half full, okay? One is there's a deliberate effort to do this. And you could see it starting in 16, it's grown in 20, and it's grown even more in 24 with the excitement in our communities about the top of the ticket. But is it enough? The 2 questions. They are doing it. They are absolutely trying. We have full participation with the campaign and all the events we're doing. We're participating with them in every launch that they're doing, particularly in the states where we're active right now, which is Michigan and Georgia. But is it enough? Is it commensurate with the need and the desire of our community to engage? Look, I'm always going to complain about that, okay? But to some extent, the organizations that are on this call and the people working on it, whether we're volunteers or we have paid staffs, that's what we do also. We fill the gap. We see where the need exists and we dive in. We do not hesitate to go raise the money and spend the money in places where we think the campaign is not doing it. And I'll give you a simple example. Our community, the AANHPI community, is basically 38 countries, hundreds of languages. It's small and scattered, but yet it's proportionate. There's a mosque in Detroit, represented by City Councilman Scott Benson. He organized a community hall meeting, and there were 300 people from Bangladesh and West Bengal in that room. And we had people who could speak Bengali. But the campaign could never have thought of doing that, okay? We have to think of doing that. We have another community that has a Burmese center where 150 people from Burma showed up, Burmese Americans, all potential voters. And the lieutenant governor went and visited with them and spent an hour and took hundreds of photographs. All I can tell you is we have to look at our community differently than a broad national campaign is going to. It's hundreds of different parts, sliced and diced by generation, by date of birth, by everything. We have to do some of that work for them. But they're doing much more than any campaign has ever done before, i.e., we're getting better, but are we still satisfied? Hell no.
Shekhar, there are a number of questions for you in the chat, and I hope you could just stick on for a few minutes and answer those questions. We move on next to Christine Chen, who will discuss some of the key findings from the Asian American Voter Survey, which was released in July. I believe many of you have seen the AABS, but we welcome Christine to discuss the findings as they relate to voting. Welcome, Christine.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. API Vote, for those of you who don't know, we're the nation's leading nonprofit focusing on building political power by increasing voter and civic participation. We really do that by really investing in local nonprofits and the infrastructure there. So the exciting news is that some of the trends that we're seeing is that even starting in 2020, AAPI registrants are growing at a rate of 1.28 times larger than the Asian American Pacific Islander citizen voting age population. In other words, 18 years and older and US citizens. We do know that TargetSmart in the next few weeks will be releasing new data on voter registration. I've been promised that there is going to be some interesting information about the AAPI registration rates. So we're really anxious to actually look at that. But this is what is showing us is that since 2020, that our community continues to actually be engaged and are registering. We have a lot of catch up to do because in 2020, I used to say only half of our family or friends were registered and ready to vote. But now we're actually seeing that shift because in 2020, we saw that 60% actually turned out. The other exciting trend that we're seeing is that in 2020, 21% of the voters that the Asian American voters that turned out were first-time voters. That was even higher in battleground states where you saw, like in Georgia, 26% of the API's voters were first-time voters, and in Nevada, it was 25%. And we actually saw that increase across the board, across all the presidential battleground states, as well as other states as well. The other thing I really want to point out is that how does that actually turn out in terms of us being a margin of victory? I know Shekhar talked about this a little bit more, but I want to go ahead and talk about Georgia as an example. So back in 2020, Biden won Georgia, the margin of victory was less than 12,000 votes. The number of APIs who voted in 2020 in Georgia was over 142,000, knowing that 26% were first-time voters. If you do the math, that's about 39,000 voters, 3 times the margin of victory, right? So these are concrete ways and numbers that we're seeing where we actually are making a difference. Now, when it comes to our Asian American voter survey, we're also seeing that there's a lot of excitement. And this is, please note that this Asian American voter survey was actually conducted earlier in April and May. So this was obviously before Kamala Harris declared. We will be having another Asian American Pacific Islander voter survey being conducted by API Vote and API Data that will be coming out at the end of September with new information. But, I think this actually still gives us some interesting insights. 90% of our community continues to plan to vote. We also know that back in 2022, 73% of our community decided to vote early or by mail. And this time through our survey, we're seeing that 51% are planning to vote in person, but then 46% are still planning to vote by mail or to drop it off. We think that number is going to continue to increase as we continue to educate our voters about the different options and how they can actually do that. Now, in terms of party identification, we continue to see some shifts, but still primarily Democrats are still winning over the Asian American voters at 42%. 31% are independent voters, and now 22% identify as Republican. Now, when you actually take those who are saying that they're independent and ask them if they lean one way or the other, the Democrats actually gain about to 51%, and then independents actually get smaller to 19%, and then 28% identifies Republicans. Chinese, Indian, and Japanese Americans are the top 3 ethnic communities that highly identify as Democrats, and Vietnamese Americans actually lean more Republican. But this time around, we're also seeing that 42% nationwide Vietnamese are identifying as Democrats, 37% as Republican. So the other thing I do want to go ahead and know is a little bit about outreach is that still, even earlier this year, only 42% say that they still were not contacted by the political parties. 50% said they were never contacted by Democrats, and 57% said that they were never contacted by the Republicans. And that's why the work of what the C3, C4s, the PACs, all the different entities are really important, because these are all the different ways that we can engage the community to motivate them to turn out to vote. And then lastly, I want to end is regards to issue importance. Jobs and economy, healthcare, inflation, and crime continue to be the top issues, bread and butter issues. Right after that is education, Social Security, Medicare, and national security. When we ask them about party evaluation between Democrats and Republicans, one thing I want to note is that depending on the issue that they're talking about, it ranges from 24% to a high of 42%, saying that there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. And that's why there's still a need for the political parties and the candidates to actually invest and do that work. For API Vote, we are investing this year close to $7 million. With that, we are subgranting about $3 million to local partners. And then we're also using that to actually reach 2 million households, close to 2 million households with in-language mailers. That means there's 18 different languages, 36 different versions, in 23 key states. And then that will then be followed up with our partners with phone banking, text banking, and in some places, canvassing operations. And then we're also going to be investing in translated videos and agile digital ads, where we will be geofencing certain areas to be able to service the proper in-language ads to the different communities. So looking forward to this conversation.
Perfect. Christine, thank you so much. One key question before we move on to Mohan. What about the critical 18 to 34 vote? Where are they?
Well, I think that's why we're what we've been hearing, whether it's on the ground, but also I'm really anxious to hear from Target Smart, because what we've heard is that there's an increase of 18 to 34-year-olds registering. And so we're looking at, and also women are actually registering at higher rates as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christine. In the interest of time, we are going to move on to Mohan Seshadri, who joins us from Pennsylvania. Mohan, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. As Sunita said, my name is Mohan. I'm the Executive Director of APIPA, the Asian Pacific Islander Political Alliance. We're Pennsylvania's first and only statewide Pan-Asian 501c4 advocacy and political organization. We were founded by community leaders and community organizations all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, representing many of our diverse communities all across PA, leaders and organizations who'd spent literal decades organizing at the grassroots level, at the neighborhood level, at the city level, for Asian American political power and access to government, to democracy, and to justice for our communities, but who'd never had a single statewide Pan-Asian political voice to speak through in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. When we launched in 2020, we doubled the Asian American vote in Pennsylvania, and that doubling provided fully half of President Biden's margin of victory in PA. In 2022, we ran a year-long voter contact program, the largest in the country, and were successful not just in electing the governor and Senator Fetterman, but also in flipping the Pennsylvania State House along the way. And this year, we're going to once again run the largest Asian American voter contact program in the country. We're going to knock on 500,000 doors in 22 languages. We're going to make 5 million phone calls in 22 languages. We're going to send 1 million pieces of mail in the languages our communities speak, with representation from our community leaders on it, in order to meet every single member of our community where they are and make sure they know not just how to vote in this critical election, but also which candidates up and down the ballot are actually going to listen to and fight for our communities. So we're not just throwing down for Vice President Harris and Senator Casey. We also have 25 state House, state Senate, and congressional races all across the state that we believe is of critical importance to advancing the cause of Asian American political power and justice for our communities all across Pennsylvania, places where our Asian American community is the margin of victory, as other folks said, not just at the statewide level, as we are in PA these days, but also at the state House level, the state Senate level, and congressional level. And there's real power to be built for our community through making sure that we're mobilizing our community in the 22 languages that our folks speak all across Pennsylvania for these down ballot races as well. Of course, we're a year-round organization that's working in the community every single day, 365 days a year, which means while we have a year-round voter contact election program that works at every level of the ballot all across the state in 22 languages, we're also laser focused on the issues affecting our community. Some of y'all may have heard about the Save Chinatown campaign, which fights to defend Philadelphia's Chinatown from destruction by 3 predatory developers who want to build a basketball arena on the edge of Philly's Chinatown and do a land grab of our 150-year-old community. So in addition to throwing down on the elections, right now this week with City Council coming back into session, tomorrow, we're mobilizing over 4,000 of our community members here in Philly to march on City Hall and make sure that our City Council is hearing our voices and making sure that they don't put an arena in the heart of our city and they don't destroy Philadelphia's Chinatown process. And so that's the task we have here in Pennsylvania. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to organize our community year-round all across this huge state, the 700,000 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who call Pennsylvania home. We have to fight for them on the issues. We have to mobilize them around legislation that's going to advance mental health access for our community. We have to fight off predatory development that's going to devastate our ethnic neighborhoods. And we have to mobilize them around elections to support candidates who are going to listen to and fight for our community. And that's why we're so committed to building deep Asian American political power all across the Commonwealth, because we're led by leaders who spent years in the community mobilizing our voters, who know how to get this done. And we have a track record of success. We won in 2020. We won in 2022, and through our program this year, where we've been on the doors for this election since January 1st, and we're going to be on the doors and on the phones and in people's mailboxes about the election until the election is done. And then we're going to mobilize to defend our democracy after that to make sure every vote gets counted. We're going to make sure that we're going to win Pennsylvania up and down the ballot for our candidates from our communities. We're going to fight for our interests and make sure that our voices are heard in every part of government, in every part of Pennsylvania, as well as DC.
Mohan, thank you. A couple of questions have come up. Many news organizations have identified Pennsylvania as the state who's going to determine this election. Is that hype, or do you see that happening?
No, it's not hype. It's absolutely, like, Pennsylvania is the battleground of battlegrounds. It's where everything's going down. And that means that for our community, when we're the margin of victory, there's an intense opportunity to build local grassroots political power and resource long-term organizations that are doing the work in our community day after day, year after year, who are already the trusted messengers for our community. That's why we're the largest Asian American voter contact program in the country, because Pennsylvania is so important. But we're able to turn that resource and that focus on us and our elections into year-round political power that supports Chinatown, that supports the Vietnamese community in South Philly, that supports justice for Christian Hall and every other Asian American who's affected by mental health access and violence against our community. That's the task at hand in Pennsylvania when there is such a focus on us year after year, presidential cycle after presidential cycle. It's not just how do we raise and spend as much money as possible. It's how do we do it in a way that brings real political power to our communities on the ground along the way. How do we build organizations? How do we train organizers? How do we build leadership in our community? And that's what we're here to do.
Thank you. There's one more question for you before we move on to Dr. Nguyen. To what extent are AAPI voters concerned about anti-China rhetoric?
I would say deeply concerned. We've suffered immensely from the last 4 years of nonstop anti-Asian violence, anti-Chinese violence, but in a way that has spilled over into the Vietnamese community, into the Cambodian community, into the Indonesian community, and the Korean community as well. And so I think our community members, especially in Philly, where that violence has been especially stark and noticeable, they're especially concerned about this anti-China rhetoric because they see the direct material impact on our communities on the ground. Of course, our communities are incredibly diverse. And so it's important to know that while many of our East Asian communities, for example, are concerned about Chinatown and this anti-China rhetoric, our Southeast Asian communities are getting hit so hard by an intense increase in deportations. Deportations of Southeast Asians in Pennsylvania, especially the Cambodian community and these refugee communities, have tripled, almost quadrupled in the last year. These deportations and the targeting of our Southeast Asian communities in Pennsylvania was a critical reason why traditionally Republican constituencies like Vietnamese Americans voted blue in 2020 in Pennsylvania, voted for Biden in 2020 because they saw the way Donald Trump's ICE department targeted our Southeast Asian communities for deportation and came to South Philadelphia in order to do that targeting. But we're incredibly concerned that if the Biden administration continues on this path that they're on right now, they're going to lose our votes. And so in addition to mobilizing our voters for Kamala Harris, we've also called on the Biden-Harris administration to shift course when it comes to supporting our immigrant and refugee communities, not just for the moral and ethical and justice reasons of our communities deserve dignity and our families deserve to be whole in the places where they grew up, but also because we can't afford to lose a single vote in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. And every vote, every one of our voters is going to count this year. And our Southeast Asian voters are going to be voting based on their families remaining whole. Our West Asian voters are going to be voting based on what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East. And we need our elected officials and the candidates we're backing to hear those voters and make sure that they're being accountable to them, shifting course when it's necessary in order to earn our people's votes.
Mohan, thank you so much. Our next guest is a familiar face, Dr. Tung Nguyen, who shepherded us through 2 years of the COVID pandemic. But I want to stress here to reporters that Dr. Nguyen joins us here in his personal capacity as president of Pivot, and he will share his organization's unique strategies for engaging Vietnamese American voters. Dr. Nguyen, welcome back.
Thank you, Sunita. Greetings, everybody. I'm representing Pivot, the Progressive Vietnamese American Organization, and we're a national org working to engage and empower Vietnamese Americans for a just and diverse America. Historically, as you've heard from Christine, the Vietnamese American voting population has been the most conservative among the AA and HPI communities, partly due to past association of the Republican Party with anti-communism. Many of us in the community, however, thought two things back in the mid-2016, 2017. One was that this was an outdated perception of the Vietnamese American electorate because the more moderate, liberal, progressive people were much quieter. And then two, that those of us who were not conservative needed to rally and create a supportive community, as well as to elect candidates that are actually good for Vietnamese Americans. And that's how Pivot was born. Since then, we have worked really hard to keep our community informed. There is rampant mis and disinformation in our communities, both in English, but especially in Vietnamese, with much of that bad content coming out on YouTube. We created a project called Viet Fact Check, which is a nonpartisan information service that has really served as a model for bilingual anti-disinformation work in Asian American communities. Electorally, we have also engaged in work through our 501c4 and super PAC arms. In 2020 and 2022, we implemented a massive bilingual ads campaign online in English and Vietnamese to persuade voters in swing states. And our ads reach hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese Americans, including many on conservative platforms. We also collaborate on the ground with local AAPI organizations such as Mohan's, by helping them with their Vietnamese materials and outreach through our Pivot Fellows programs, which embedded young Vietnamese American activists in organizations that have local know-how. Our fellows made hundreds of thousands of voter touches. We are using the same model, this bilingual digital online campaign and on-the-ground voter engagement this year. We recently conducted some focus groups with these voters to understand where they are coming from. And what we learned was that many young Vietnamese American voters are all in on Harris, but some are holding back primarily because of the situation in Gaza. We are also learning that some older Vietnamese American voters who used to support Trump are either less vocal about him or less enthusiastic about him, or have been turned off by him, mostly not around policy issues, but around character issues. And this seems to have started with the insurrection in January 2021. And these focus group findings reflect what we saw in the survey data presented earlier by Christine Chen. The Vietnamese American electorate is shifting from majority Republican and Trump supporters to a toss-up between Republicans and Democrats, with a significant portion of around 25% who are independent that can still be persuaded. We're going to use all of this information as well as engage our network of volunteers to engage Vietnamese American voters. Our fellows programs are in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Nevada, Arizona, and with the shifting of the map, we're going to hope to have one in Georgia as well. We are planning to send out 100,000 postcards to Vietnamese American voters. And we have developed our digital ads and are disseminating them. And our goal is to reach every single Vietnamese American voter online or through traditional Vietnamese media with ads in English and Vietnamese many times over. We believe, as many in this press conference have said, that Asian Americans, ANHPIs, and Vietnamese Americans are the margin of victory in the swing states. But that in order to win their votes, we need to reach them where they are, whether it is in person or online, in the languages they speak, and by reaching them with correct information about issues that they care about. The Vietnamese American communities matter, and our votes matter. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. There are a number of questions for you. Which of the strategies that Pivot has implemented can be successfully implemented by other communities attempting to engage with low propensity voters?
I think the sort of in-person strategy that we use that I think is very useful, particularly in communities with a lot of different groups, is for us to support work in one group. So, for example, we focus on Vietnamese American. For example, Mohan's group focus on all Asian American, and API Victory Fund focus on all Asian American, and they do a good job, but they need help with particular individual groups. And that's where we come in and provide them with that extra expertise to give them some sort of marginal help there. So I think by thinking about each community, I mean, I can imagine, for example, the Latinx or Latina community could be, we're not just working on people from Mexico, we're working on people from Puerto Rico, from Central America. We need that kind of segmentation, because I don't think thinking of our communities as monolithic, whether it's Asians or Latino or Black or whichever community, they're not monolithic. Some people are going to be good at doing some things than others. I think online, I think is a very effective way, as long as you know what you're doing in terms of tailoring the messages and the people telling them about the issue. I do really think that, in a very nonpartisan way, there's just a lot of misinformation out there. We just have to get the right information and trust our people to do the right thing.
There's another question for you. How potent is the crime issue? Crime has fallen, but the perception is that it's rising. How do you address disinformation about crime, specifically hate crimes, which have so impacted our communities?
Yeah, no, I think hate crimes and anti-Asian hate crimes in particular has been an incredibly important and powerful force in driving people to vote because they care about themselves and their family and the safety of everyone. I think the way to think about it is that there are two different ways of thinking about crime. One is just crime in general, and one is hate crime. Crime in general, is certainly in many places are actually on the trend downward, not upward. So I think it's important to be accurate about that information so that not to unnecessarily frighten people. On the other hand, hate crimes are on the rise, and therefore we have to address that by saying, well, what are the causes of hate crimes? Why are we so afraid? And that would be xenophobia. That would be gun violence and lack of gun control. among and sort of white supremacy. I think if we are looking at the right target, so rather than saying, well, I'm afraid of crime, therefore we should, hire more police officers, which isn't a necessarily an unreasonable approach, we should think about, if I'm worried about anti-Asian hate, what are the things that are making anti-Asian hate go up? And then think about how we can do that and address that through our votes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wen. Before we move on to Dr. Zarda Diaz, Anjana Nagarajan Bhutani has a very important question that I think Christine Chen might be able to answer. Anjana, could you please ask your question?
Hi, this is a question for anybody who wants to take it. The statistics show us that the number of Americans who identify as biracial or multiracial is increasing quite rapidly. How do they vote or lean politically? I'm curious. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is not specific data on that. There are very few surveys. So that's one thing that we're still trying to get the media outlets and those that actually poll voters to actually be able to do that. It is also, and so right now, even with our Asian American voter survey, we're taking the top 6 largest Asian populations that represent about 85% of the demographic until we're able to get better data identification of the voter files for the smaller ethnic communities, as well as more funding. That's the only way we can actually dig deeper. I do know Pew has been doing a lot more survey data, not necessarily just about voters. So you may want to take a look at that as well.
Christine, there's another question for you about the AAVS. How concerned are Asian Americans with border issues, especially as we see the number of immigrants coming across via the borders, undocumented immigrants coming across borders who are from Asian countries?
Are you asking about, immigration in general?
Yes.
Oh, got it. Okay. So right now, at least according to our Asian American voter survey, they feel that Republicans at 33% are doing a little bit better than Democrats at 28% in terms of immigration. Actually, no, I'm sorry. 35% is Republicans are doing better, 33% for Democrats, but 24% still say there's no difference. So you still have a large segment where there's still not enough differentiation between the two.
Got it. We move on next to Dr. James Zarda Diaz, who is going to talk about the roots of Asian American conservatism. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Sunita, and thank you everyone for being on this call. It's a pleasure to be with you. Just a little bit of background. So I know a lot of folks on this panel, esteemed co-panelists, are representing PACs, nonprofit groups, voter outreach organizations. I'm here as a historian, as an academic who's trying to get a better sense of the political landscape of Asian America, and I focus on contemporary Asian American history, and that's my training. I'm currently doing research and writing a book tentatively called The Asian American Conservative. I recently wrote a piece in the LA Times, an op-ed in July that talks a little bit about Asian American conservatism, not necessarily about the Republican Party, but Asian Americans who lean right or have flirtations with the right, whether that is within the GOP or otherwise. And so I'm here today to kind of talk a little about the contemporary history. I think it's important, especially for journalists, to understand maybe why shifts have occurred, why there's a swing to the left, sometimes a swing to the right. And I think this is really important context when you're doing your stories. And a lot of you know this as well, but I think it's really good to kind of have a refresher on that contemporary history to understand now where we are in the 2020s. So a little bit of some turning points, and of course, there's wonderful data like Christine knows and other folks on this call about Asian American voting habits, NHPI voting habits over time. But I'd say that as a historian, really the major turning point in terms of the Asian American electorate occurred in the 1990s. Up until the year 2000, in terms of presidential elections, Asian American voters leaned right. So, for example, the most recently in terms of when Asian Americans voted for a Republican candidate, 1996 was the most recent example, slightly voting in favor of Bob Dole over Bill Clinton. 1992, there was a larger margin of victory for George H.W. Bush among Asian American voters. 2000 turned things around where Al Gore received the majority of Asian American voters' support. And I'd say in the 1990s, a lot of this shift is occurring for a few reasons. First, for example, in California, where you have a large Asian American Pacific Islander population, the rhetoric around immigration and particularly Prop 187 was a turning point. And kind of the Republican Party at the time, especially in California, was seen as very taking a hard right turn in terms of issues of undocumented immigrants and so forth. The fear and the rise of China, so to speak, right, and just East Asia as a whole, and increased investments, especially on the West Coast, where it felt more prominent. So fears about China, but even Hong Kong, investments from Taiwan. You saw a wave of anti-Asianism and fear of Chinese people and Chinese presence in the United States in the 1990s. In the meantime, the Republican parties, I'm finding in my research, kind of goes back and forth in terms of outreach towards Asian American voters. There was a swing towards reaching out to them more actively in the early 1990s, and that starts to dissipate and decline in the middle part of the 90s and certainly by the 2000s. And so while that's happening, as the GOP is not investing as much in Asian American voter outreach, the Democratic Party, on the other hand, is doubling down in investing in Asian American outreach. And that's embodied in, for example, when Bill Clinton does more appointees of Asian Americans in his administration, in the courts, through the bureaucracy and other spaces of government, where that representation is seen, right, within the Asian American community. They notice that. And then lastly, I'd say in the 1990s, this shift occurs because in the mid-1990s, the Republican Revolution in 1994 with Newt Gingrich and the kind of groundswell of support of Republican Party politics in the Sun Belt in particular, and really kind of shifted the priorities of the party. And for some Asian Americans, they were turned off in the Republican Party's positions on social issues, for example, abortion or maybe education, and immigration as well. And that kind of, again, kind of made some Asian Americans question their loyalty to the Republican Party. And ever since, you've seen, as you know, the data, they trend Democratic or are independents that lean left, right? A couple of other things to note in terms of contemporary history is that I would say in this kind of post-2015, post-2016 Republican Party and conservative politics, I wouldn't say that GOP activism within the Asian American community is climbing significantly. It's definitely there, and you see them throughout the United States. But I would say that there's also a lot of registered Asian American Democrats who are starting to move more right. So they're voting for maybe center left or more moderate Democrats, as opposed to backing folks who are more liberal or more progressive. We see that here. I'm based in San Francisco. We see that in some of the recent elections, the voting out of Chesa Boudin, the progressive district attorney. You saw a lot of Asian Americans in the city who are registered Democrats who did not appreciate some of the teaching that was seen as controversial of critical race theory, or things that were seen as anti-American, and they voted out school board members. And you're seeing that in other parts of the United States too, in places like suburban Virginia. The Supreme Court decision that came out around affirmative action, also a touchy subject within the community, where a lot of AAPIs feel disenfranchised from particularly admissions in colleges and universities. And I'd say the COVID-19 pandemic was a huge turning point. Obviously, you saw the rise of anti-Asianism, and a lot of Asian Americans, particularly in urban areas, felt a lack of support from government leaders, the police, and feeling that the kind of quote unquote soft on crime and soft on hate crimes in particular kind of made them question Democratic leadership. And so you start to see these movements. I wouldn't say there's a huge swing suddenly and groundswell Asian Americans registering now as Republicans, but you start to see these more moderate factions emerge and maybe questioning their loyalties to the Democratic Party, or at least progressive politics. So I'll just kind of keep it at that. I know we want to keep to time, but I would love to engage with you if you have any questions about the kind of contemporary history of Asian American conservatism. And I think, as we'll see, the NHPI vote is going to be really critical in places like suburban Atlanta, suburban Las Vegas, the Research Triangle, North Carolina, where there's a lot of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who could really determine outcomes of gubernatorial elections, congressional districts, Senate races, and of course the presidential race as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, James. Such important information. Our last speaker today is Republican strategist Rena Shah. Rena, welcome.
Hi, Sunita. Thanks for having me here. It's really nice to be with all of you. I had a couple observations I wanted to share with you all today, and particularly given there's so much talk about never Trumpers in the Republican Party today. But what I really wanted to start with is talking about who's identifying as independent anymore. And there's been a pretty big shift there. According to a 2024 excuse me, I'm so sorry. I think I might have gone off screen for a moment. Apologies. So according to a 2024 Pew Research Center report, about 40% of Asian Americans now consider themselves independent. That's up from around 33%, which was just a few years ago. So for either party to really win over this voting bloc, they need to focus on a few key things. First, they need to address issues that resonate with AA and HPI communities. Those issues are immigration reform, education, and particularly economic opportunity. A 2023 survey from the Asian American Political Alliance found that 65% of AA and HPIs are most concerned about economic policies and educational equity. Keyword, because we don't talk about equity much in the Republican Party these days. That's thought to be something that's left to the left. But secondly, both parties really, more than anything, need to engage more directly with this AA and HPI communities through not only targeted outreach, but also by addressing specific local concerns. And that could involve hosting community events, working with local leaders, and creating policies that address the unique needs of these diverse groups. So in short, what I'm saying here is to court the growing independent AA and HPI vote, it's going to take a mix of relevant policy focus as well as genuine engagement. Now, in my time with the Republican Party at the federal level, I'd also been deeply engaged at the Republican National Committee. And through the Republican National Committee, that's where you see the efforts out of that co-chair's office, again, within the campaign apparatus, primarily targeted for congressional level and federal level candidates. You've seen for decades an understanding that there needs to be genuine engagement, but the criticism always has been, and this is just for Republicans, that Republicans have come courting that Asian American vote at the 11th hour. So always in the year of a presidential contest. So the question I'm getting the most right now is, will Republicans continue to vote for Republican candidates in the down ballot races, even if they vote for Harris Walz? I love this question so much because it's one that I get every other day right now. But to that, I'll just say this. If Republicans decide to vote for Harris or Walz in the top races, it doesn't automatically mean they're going to ditch Republican candidates down ballot. Historically, voters have often split their tickets. They've supported different parties for different offices. For example, in 2020 elections, many voters chose Biden for president, but they still supported Republican candidates for Congress. So exit polls from that year show that about 9% of Biden voters still backed Republican candidates for House seats. And I realize it's a really almost insignificant number, but it means something. If we look at the upcoming races, it's likely that a similar pattern is going to continue. In a 2024 Gallup poll I saw, there was a suggestion that about 15% of voters are dissatisfied with their party's presidential candidate. And they might still stick with their party, but they might still stick with their party for down ballot races. So at the end of the day, what I'm really wanting to leave you all with is that if Republicans are not thrilled with their presidential options, but they still align with party values, they might still support GOP candidates for other positions. And that's where I wanted to leave it. So I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Absolutely. Rena, one question that comes in, do you fear that Republicans are going to sit it out, given you spoke about never Trumpers? Is that going to influence the number of people who just sit it out this time around?
I've been very concerned about the lack of political participation across some key demographics, but yes, very much so with Asian Americans in the aftermath of Kamala Harris becoming the nominee. Now, I realize that might surprise some folks, but there is a sentiment out there, and I don't know that it's widely held or that we have enough empirical evidence to back it up, but it's that she has chosen one side of herself versus another, instead of just being a biracial person that is allowed to embrace one side of herself when she's in certain rooms. And just because she's doing that doesn't mean she's rejecting this other side. But this assumption does carry some degree of weight with right-leaning voters, those who either are independently minded, center-right, or again, moderate R's who voted for Biden in 2020. Those people are a bit lukewarm about her still. Of course, historically speaking, we've never seen a modern presidential candidate have such short period of time to conduct a real campaign. So this reintroduction of herself that she's doing, this is happening in real time. Strategists like me are looking at this and we see it going well. But what is at the end of the day going to matter? The numbers we see in 7 states on election day, was she able to swing certain women, particularly white, liberal, left-leaning women? Is she going to be able to get them to turn out and not stay home? Because these were the type of people, white liberals in particular, who were the reason that Hillary Clinton was not able to win that electoral college vote. And Kamala Harris might have something of the same problem that might rely a little bit more on her identity versus anything else.
And does Tim Walz negate some of that?
I have not yet seen, again, any data that backs up my assertion that he has been negating some of it, because he brings the Midwestern streak, which is not just a streak of sense and sensibility. It is a culture. Midwest has become a culture in the United States, and much like being a Southerner was in the United States. But what we've seen in the modern era is Floridians, for example, no longer introduce themselves as Southerners. They want to say, I'm a Floridian, because they don't want to be grouped in with rural states such as Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas. But Midwest, still in the year 2024, you do hear people saying, I'm from the Midwest. And therefore, those people feel a sense of, there's a Midwesterner like me in Walz. So yes, there's a bit of counteraction here, but I don't have any kind of data to back this up.
Thank you, Rena, for your remarks. We now move to final remarks from all speakers who are still with us. Dr. Nguyen, what is the most important thing you'd like reporters to take away from this briefing?
I think the most important thing is that there is a lot of enthusiasm in this election, and we need to get people out. And I think from the reporting perspective, I think it's important for you all to get accurate information out about the candidates. That's what we all ask for. Let them know. I love the issue focus with Rena. Let's get where do they stand on economic policy? Where do they stand on immigration policy? That I trust our voters as long as they get adequate information.
Thank you. Mohan, your most important takeaway.
I think just to remember, for all the reporters out there, to remember the importance of talking to local organizations, talking to leaders on the ground. And you all do such amazing work on this already, but continuing to cover the local issues and the local fights affecting our community, not just the election implications, not just the national implications, but what are the issues that our communities are mobilizing, protecting our people's homes, making sure that we have mental health access, making sure that our communities are safe year-round, 24/7, and of course, covering the local organizations who are fighting for candidates who are going to be accountable to our communities, who are going to listen to our people, and who are going to fight for our communities.
Thank you so much, Mohan. James.
Yeah, I echo those sentiments, and I'll just say, as someone who's doing a lot of research on this as well, is trying to also get the voices of Asian American voters and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander voters who maybe are not normally at the forefront of American politics. So what I mean is that, again, a lot of conservative voices out there too, that it's important to hear their perspective, even if you don't necessarily agree with their views. It's helpful in terms of understanding where the voters are and how to just generate and create better legislation. And to be more targeted with your outreach. So I'd say that those are important things, and just vote. So good to be with you all.
Thank you, James. Christine.
Yeah, you know what? As we know, our voters are motivated, but they need better information. They need to know what's on their ballot. How can they research it? So anything that you can do to focus on the issues, where the candidates actually stand on different issues, and to also fight back on mis and disinformation that you may be hearing. And so that's a really important role. The other thing I also put in the chat is that I also welcome all the media outlets to help us celebrate National Voter Registration Day that's coming up on September 17th. Because many times we get calls on our Asian hotline on election day, and they're like, how do I vote? I want to vote. And we ask them, are you registered? And they never registered. So we don't want anyone to be in that predicament. So it's really the strength of your outlets and your networks and the information that you provide that can actually help prevent mis and disinformation and actually remind everyone about what is the process for registering to vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Rena, last word.
Sure. I think for me, the most important part is folks should not believe that this election outcome will perhaps be determined on the night of or even the next day. And we should have hope in that, and we should have faith in our institutions. And that can be done through journalism, instilling and reinstilling that faith for people that our institutions work, they have survived. And though we are a young democracy, it takes all of us who are here to be part of it and to make it work the way it needs to work. So I echo my co-panelists here who have talked about, just really promulgating the importance of voting, but for people to know that their vote does matter. There's going to be a great deal of misinformation and disinformation continually just thrown at folks from various sources that are not you all. And so that's what my one request would be as a political strategist. I want everybody at the table. I want everybody participating and understanding their system. And that can really be done through the vehicle that you all provide. So please do reach out to me at any time if I could be an asset or augment your work in any way. It'd be a pleasure. And thank you for having me and all of us here today.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. And thank you, reporters, for joining us. We'll see you next Friday.
Guys, this is it from the special report. You were watching Desi TV. Take good care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.